Hello, everyone. I want to talk to you guys about this story of a murderer that has just taken over headlines. I actually did not know about this story until today. I was scrolling through the news on my phone and I saw a headline about some guy who stabbed a bunch of people to death. And I thought, what the hell is this? I have not heard of this story. It really goes to show how much I focus more on stories that have happened in other countries than I do on stories that have taken place in my own country. And I read about this guy who stabbed four people to death in a house outside of a university campus. And then I saw the mugshot, and I saw the mugshot, and it looked like Ted Bundy and Jake Gyllenhaal had a baby. And then I saw this person's name, and yeah, the person's name, you guys have all heard it. It's Bryan Koberger, and he's from Pennsylvania. And Bryan Koberger was the guy is a complete animal. It's hard for me to consider these people humans. The way that they will prey upon people, the way that they will study their victims for a long time before slaughtering them, it's just very difficult for me to see any sort of humanity in these people. And I don't think that people like Koberger really have any humanity. I don't know how you can consider somebody who will spy on people, prey on people for weeks, and then go into a house and slaughter a bunch of people, stab their victims to death. I don't see how you can consider these people to have any humanity. I really don't. It's really beyond me. I cannot fathom the idea of just preying on people, studying them for weeks, staking them out for weeks, looking at their house, and then breaking in one night and then murdering them. It's just the very act itself is unfathomable. But this guy is a monster. He's a monster. I read a story about how when he was in police custody, he was screaming at the officers, telling them that he was going to. He told one of the guards that he was going to pee on his face or something like that. He was going to cut them up. He was going to murder them. He said, "Oh, I cut those people up, and I'll cut you up." I mean, the guy is a complete monster. You see his eyes. You see the demon possession. I mean, look at this guy's face. This guy is demon possessed. You can see the demonic influence. You can see just the satanic character of this person. And he studied his victims for quite some time. He was actually in the area of the crime a dozen times before slaughtering those people. They actually looked at his phone tracking information on his cell phone, and they found out that he had been in the area of the home about 12 times before going into the house and slaughtering four people. He stabbed four people to death. For some reason, he did not stab two other people who were living in the home for reasons we don't know. And as time goes on, we're going to find out more about this case. We're going to find out about his motivation. This was a guy who was studying criminal justice. I looked more into this person and found out that he was a PhD student for criminal justice, which means that he wanted to defend murderers, and he himself became a murderer. And listen, I didn't read this somewhere, but just reading about this guy, looking at his face, I can tell you right now, he was the type of guy who aspired to become a lawyer to defend murderers. And he also registered as a libertarian. A lot of libertarians are the types of people who would defend criminals, and they would be against the death penalty. Not saying all libertarians are this way, so please spare me with the comments. Oh, I'm a libertarian. I'm not like this, but a lot of libertarians are this way. They are against the death penalty because they hate government. So if the government enacts justice, they hate that. That pisses them off for some strange, bizarre reason. And I also read that he was a hardcore vegan. He actually reprimanded his aunt and uncle because they had pots in the house that were used to cook meat, and he said, "Remove all the pots and pans that have been used to cook meat because I refuse to eat anything, even if it's vegetables. I refuse to eat anything that has been cooked on a pan where animals have been cooked." The guy was a complete sicko. I read that he was a bully, that he bullied other people. I also heard that he was an assistant teacher, and that he graded other students' work, and that he was extremely harsh, extremely strict. Reminds me of Dennis Rader, who was an HOA compliance officer, and he would go to people's houses and literally measure the height of their grass so that he could then pressure them to mow their lawns and say, oh, you're going to be punished. You're going to be fined if you don't cut your grass because it's 1 centimeter too high above the standard that we have here in this property development. That sort of psychopath behavior, that sort of sick, twisted, sadistic behavior. This guy had it. He was the type of guy who was against the death penalty. Can guarantee that. He was the type of guy that, he would come to like a family gathering, just like looking at his face, right? This is just from my own experience with people. Just looking at his face, I can tell he was the type of guy who would argue with anybody. He would always argue for anything evil and twisted. So if it was for defending serial killers, he was there defending serial killers. If it was defending Sodom, he would be there defending Sodom. That's the kind of guy this is. Because years ago, I remember being in this house in Colorado, and I remember I was staying in the home of this couple, and the mom said, "Oh, my son's coming over." And I heard the father say, "Why? Why did you invite our son?" When you see a father not wanting his own son to be in the house, you just know this is going to be bad. So the son comes over and he immediately starts arguing. Almost immediately, he starts arguing with me about gay marriage, and he's like, "Love is love," and da 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 da. And then I said something like, "Oh, so if a man marries a horse, because he loves the horse, is that love? Because according to you, love is love. Doesn't matter if it doesn't matter who it's between." And his father laughed, and I remember he got pissed off and walked out of the house and all this stuff. But this guy that I argued with, he looked almost just like this guy, right? Very similar face. And I can look at the face, I can look at the countenance, I can look at the constitution and the eyes and the way that they look, and you can just tell what type of person you're dealing with. You're dealing with an argumentative, sadistic, manipulative bully, and that was seen in his most latest actions. And he reminds me of several other serial killers that have been that have existed in American history. He reminds me of Dennis Rader. I believe he actually studied when he was studying criminal justice and all that. One of his professors actually was, I believe, one of the investigators behind the case investigating Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, for those of you who don't know, was a serial killer. He is a serial killer. He's still alive. He was a good church-going family man who was a Boy Scout leader, and nobody suspected that he would ever murder anybody. His own neighbors thought that he was a good church-going man. He went to church every Sunday. He went to the Thursday night Bible study. He was the president of his church congregation, and everybody thought he was this religious church-going man, and nobody ever suspected that he would ever murder anybody. And he had a neighbor who thought that he was a nice guy. He thought that he was a good family man, until Dennis Rader actually murdered his own neighbor who saw him as a good church-going family man. That's how sick these people are. It's very hard for me to consider these people human. It's just unfathomable for me. I know they're human. I know. But I can't see the humanity in them. If you don't like that, then judge me. And there were. He also reminds me of two other serial killers. There was Richard Speck, who was a mass murderer who went into a dorm room and murdered a bunch of nursing students. And there was also Danny Rolling. Danny Rolling, I think, is the one who's closest to Koberger. Danny Rolling would hunt down university students in Florida. He would study his victims. He would go into the dorm room and he would kill them. He would stab them to death. He was an absolute evil, demonic person. In one case, he murdered a woman, chopped off her head, and put the head on the television screen. When the police went into the crime scene, they saw the decapitated head on top of the TV. He would cut off the breasts of his victims, and he would keep their nipples in a Ziploc bag. This is America, okay? America is full of this sort of stuff. I know that there are evil people and murderers in every society. America has a very high number of serial killers in our history, and they still are here. And this Koberger guy is proof of that. Looking at Koberger's eyes, you can see the murderous character. You can see the predator in him. He's a predator. He has the eyes of a predator. And he obviously is a person who is full of bloodlust, pure evil. You can see the dark spirit in him. And it reminds me of things that I have read in Josephus's book on the war between Judea and Rome. If you guys have not read Josephus's War, the book is known as War, but I think the whole book's title is something like the history on the war between Rome and Judea, something like that. But if you guys have not read Josephus's book on the war between Rome and Judea, you have to read it. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It was a book that I could not stop reading. I have read many books in my life, and most books I just have to push myself to read because they're so painfully boring and so painfully full of just annoyingly obnoxious sentences. And so I just push myself to read them because I don't like not finishing a book. And plus, I also learn things by reading them, not as boring as they are. But Josephus's book on the war between Rome and Judea was one of the few books that I have read that I enjoyed reading. I didn't really have to pressure myself to read it. It's a very long book, but it's such a good piece of literature. And because it's not just about a war, right? There's a lot of parts in the book that describe battles between the Romans and the people of Judea. But there are also a lot of descriptions that depict religion and ideology and fanaticism, and there's a lot of that in this book. There's a lot of it, and you can see the viciousness and the violence and just the bloodlust of the people who were revolting against the Roman government. And the way that Josephus describes the rebels who were against Rome, they are vicious, they are bloodthirsty, they are full of bloodlust, they are sadistic, they love cruelty. Josephus covers a lot of history in the book, and the book does not begin with the revolt against Rome. The book, I believe, if I remember correctly, the book begins with the Maccabean revolt, and then it continues on all the way to the destruction of the temple and the battle of wasn't so much of a battle, but what happened in Masada, in which a bunch of people committed suicide, and the Romans didn't have to fight them. And so Josephus, if you look at the Old Testament, I'm getting off into a different subject, but it all connects. When you look at the Old Testament gives you this very long history of ancient Israel. It starts out with Abraham and eventually goes on into the Maccabean revolt. This is if you're reading the Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox Bible, not the Protestant Bible. Josephus begins his history talking about the Maccabean revolt and then all the stuff that happens in between the Roman Judean War, and then he talks about the Roman Judean War. If you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament, it's Abraham all the way up to the Maccabean revolt, and then you go to the New Testament and it begins with the life of Christ. Josephus's work goes from Maccabean revolt all the way up to the Roman Jewish War, right? The Roman Judean War. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that you get in Josephus that you won't get in the Old Testament. And he deals with all the stuff that happened in between the life of Christ and the Maccabean revolt. Then he goes into a whole bunch of stuff that happened after the crucifixion. So you get so much information out of it, and you will learn so much, and you will gain more of an in-depth knowledge on the history of Israel and what happened before the time of Christ and what happened after the time of Christ. This is why I encourage all Christians to read this book. And Josephus does talk about the battles, but he talks, I think, a lot more on the violence that was happening, the violence that was done by the rebels. And these rebels were murderous, evil scum. I mean, they committed massacres, they murdered their own people, they murdered people who were not of their tribe. They were extremely tribal, they were extremely racist. And Josephus also talks about things that happened before the Roman Jewish War, things that happened after the Maccabean War. He talks about, for example, a civil war that took place, how there was this rebellion against the Israeli or the Israelite government, and how the government had a war with these rebels, and the king of Judea went to the rebels. He went to the leaders of the rebels, and he said, "What do you guys want me to do that would satisfy you guys, and that would have you guys stop rebelling?" And these rebels literally told the king, "Kill yourself." This is in Josephus's work. They told him, "Kill yourself." Now, when you read Josephus's book, or when you read any sort of literature from antiquity, one thing that you will learn is that human beings have not changed. Doesn't matter how lacking they were in technology. It doesn't matter how fast they died. It doesn't matter how young it doesn't matter how young people died, because nowadays we live a lot longer. People didn't change, right? They were the same. Didn't matter if the mortality rate was a lot higher in those days than it is now. People did not change. They were people who were murderous. They were people who were evil. They were people who were just absolute scum. They were sinister. Didn't matter if the average person died at the age of 20 or whatever. People were the same. They didn't change. Didn't matter that they didn't have the technology that we have now, right? We have cell phones, internet, all this stuff. They didn't have that, but people didn't change. They weren't that different. In those days, people were telling their king to go kill himself. Today, people will tell you to go kill yourself if they don't like you on some forum, on some YouTube comment section. People haven't changed. And when you read Josephus's book on the war between Rome and Judea, you see so many examples of people who were just drunk off of blood rage and bloodlust. And when I read about this Bryan Koberger guy from Pennsylvania, I see that same sinister, evil spirit has not gone away. Be it in any serial killer, be it in any terrorist, the spirit of evil still lingers. Anyway, you guys heard some theology. God bless.